What my husband never knew when he secretly drained our joint savings was that my family owned the very banking network where he thought he'd hidden the money. His expression when I produced his complete transfer history and froze all his accounts during our divorce proceedings? Absolutely priceless. Before we dive into today's story, I want to thank each of you for being part of this journey of resilience and justice. If you're finding value in these real-life lessons, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps our community grow stronger together. Now, let's begin. I noticed the change in Richard about 6 months after his promotion to regional director at Westlake Pharmaceuticals. Small things at first, late nights at the office, sudden business trips, hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. The classic signs, I suppose, though I was too trusting to see them clearly at the time. Our sprawling Tudor-style home in Oakwood Heights, the one Richard insisted we needed to reflect his new position, felt increasingly empty as his presence diminished. The 4,000 square feet that once represented our shared dream now echoed with his absence and occasional condescension. "You wouldn't understand the pressure I'm under," he'd say whenever I questioned the growing distance between us. His custom-tailored, Brioni suit jacket tossed carelessly across the kitchen island I'd designed. Managing 40 people and a multi-million-dollar operation isn't something just anyone can grasp. The subtle dismissal in his voice became a familiar companion in our 10th year of marriage. I'd nod and retreat to my home office, where I managed our household finances, a task Richard deemed cute, but inconsequential compared to his corporate responsibilities. "Elena, honey," he'd say, leaning against my doorframe with that patronizing smile that had begun to grate on my nerves. "Don't stress yourself with those spreadsheets. That's why we have financial advisors." He'd tap his Patek Philippe watch, a gift from me on our 8th anniversary, and add, "Time is money, and some of us understand that better than others." What Richard conveniently forgot, or perhaps never truly appreciated, was my background before we met. My quiet management of our personal accounts wasn't due to a lack of financial acumen. Rather, it was the opposite. Growing up as the granddaughter of Franklin Mercer, founder of Mercer Banking Group, I'd been steeped in financial literacy since childhood. By 16, I was sitting in on board meetings. By 22, I'd earned my MBA in finance from Wharton, and by 25, I was managing a significant portion of our family's private investment portfolio. But when I met Richard at a charity gala 12 years ago, I'd made a conscious choice to keep my family connections private. Too many previous relationships had soured once men discovered the Mercer name on my driver's license. Some became intimidated, others saw only dollar signs, and a few particularly ambitious ones viewed me as a corporate networking opportunity. So when Richard asked about my family during our third date at that little Italian restaurant in the West Village, I simply said, "They're in finance," and changed the subject. I wanted to be loved for myself, not my family's net worth or connections. Richard seemed refreshingly uninterested in my background, focused instead on our shared love of historical architecture and French cinema. The irony wasn't lost on me later. The man who claimed financial sophistication never bothered to research his wife's maiden name or question why my middle-class parents could afford to give us a substantial down payment on our first home. When we married, I maintained my personal accounts separate from our joint ones, a decision Richard attributed to my cute independent streak. In reality, it was my grandfather's insistence. "Never commingle all your assets," he'd advised over brandy at my engagement dinner, his voice low enough that Richard, chatting with my father across the room, couldn't hear. "Love with your heart, Elena, but protect yourself with your head." I'd followed his advice, maintaining my position on several family boards while telling Richard I volunteered at financial literacy nonprofits. Not entirely a lie, as I did chair the Mercer Foundation's education initiative. My girls' weekends often coincided with quarterly board meetings, and my book club discussions frequently covered the latest banking regulations rather than bestsellers. For years, this arrangement worked seamlessly. Richard built his career at Westlake, climbing from marketing director to regional leadership, while I quietly managed our household and my family responsibilities in parallel universes that never needed to intersect. Until I noticed the first unexplained withdrawal from our joint savings account. It was a Tuesday afternoon in April when my quarterly review of our finances revealed a $10,000 transfer to an account I didn't recognize. When I casually mentioned it over dinner, Richard's reaction, a momentary freezing of his fork midway, to his mouth, followed by an too smooth recovery, triggered something primal in my banker's instincts. "Oh, that," he said, cutting his steak with practiced precision. "Just moving some funds for our tax advantage. Nothing for you to worry about." But I did worry. And I watched. And I waited. Over the next 3 months, more transfers followed. $15,000 here. $20,000 there. Always to the same mysterious account. Always followed by the same dismissive explanation when questioned. "It's complex financial strategy, Elena," he'd say, his voice taking on that particular tone reserved for explaining supposedly complicated matters to someone he considered financially naive. "Mark's helping me set up some investments that will really secure our future." Mark Donovan, his college roommate turned financial advisor. The same Mark who'd faced a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation 2 years prior for administrative oversights with client funds. Little did Richard know how significant my deliberate omission about my family would become, or how completely his financial maneuvering would backfire in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. By late summer, the transfers had escalated. What began as occasional 5-figure movements had become a systematic draining of our joint accounts. Nearly $350,000, more than half our liquid savings, had vanished into what I now knew was a private account at First Regional Bank, a mid-sized institution with branches throughout the Northeast. I'd uncovered this information not through confrontation, but through careful observation. A bank statement left carelessly in Richard's home office during one of his essential weekend conferences. A conversation with our accountant that Richard didn't know I'd scheduled. Small breadcrumbs that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Still, I maintained my role as the oblivious wife. Each morning, I'd kiss Richard goodbye as he left for work. His designer briefcase containing documents I'd carefully photographed the night before while he slept. Each evening, I'd listen to his stories about difficult clients and incompetent subordinates, never letting on that I'd spent my day reconstructing his financial betrayal. "You seem distracted," he remarked one evening as I prepared our dinner, the routine we'd maintained despite his increasing detachment. "Still struggling with the household budget?" "Just trying to make sure we're on track for that vacation to Bali you promised," I replied, chopping vegetables with perhaps more force than necessary. "Flights are getting expensive." He laughed, the sound tinged with something I couldn't quite identify. "Maybe we should postpone. The market's a bit unpredictable right now." He sipped his bourbon, the $200 bottle I'd given him for his birthday. "Sometimes it's better to be cautious with large expenditures." Caution. From the man who'd just transferred another $50,000 that morning to his secret account. I smiled and continued chopping. "Whatever you think is best, Richard. You're the financial expert in this marriage." What Richard didn't realize, what he couldn't have known, was that my quiet compliance masked a very different reality. The evening before, concerned by the accelerating pace of his transfers, I'd finally made a call I'd hoped to avoid. "Grandfather," I'd said when Franklin Mercer's familiar voice answered. "I need to discuss something confidential." At 84, my grandfather remained sharp as ever, still serving as chairman emeritus of the Mercer Banking Group. His office at the Manhattan headquarters, a wood-paneled sanctuary overlooking Central Park, had been my refuge during college summers. It was where I'd learned to analyze financial statements, evaluate investment opportunities, and most importantly, identify patterns of deception. "Elena," he'd replied, instantly alert despite the late hour. "What's wrong?" I'd explained the situation clinically as he'd taught me. Facts first, emotions later. The timeline of transfers. The evasive explanations. The mounting evidence that Richard was systematically hiding our marital assets. Grandfather had listened in silence, interrupting only to clarify details. When I finished, he asked just one question. "What do you want to do about it?" "I want tea. To understand what he's planning before I confront him," I'd said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "I need to know where the money is going and why." "First Regional, you said?" His tone had shifted subtly, and I could picture him reaching for his leather-bound address book, the one containing contact information for every banking executive worth knowing on the Eastern Seaboard. Interesting choice. Only later would I appreciate the magnificent understatement in those two words. First Regional wasn't just any regional bank. It was one of 17 smaller institutions that Mercer Banking Group had acquired discreetly over the past decade. Acquisitions handled through holding companies and maintained under their original. Branding to preserve customer relationships and avoid regulatory scrutiny. In simpler terms, Richard had unknowingly hidden our money in a bank my family effectively owned. The irony might have been amusing if the betrayal hadn't cut so deep, I'll lie. "Make some inquiries," Grandfather had promised. "Discreetly. We'll know more tomorrow." Now, as I served Richard his perfectly cooked steak, medium rare with peppercorn sauce, just as he preferred, I contemplated the preliminary information Grandfather's inquiries had already uncovered. The account Richard had established was no ordinary savings vehicle. It was a high-yield business account, opened under the name Westlake Consulting LLC, a shell company he'd incorporated 3 months earlier without my knowledge. The address listed was a P.O. box in Connecticut, not far from where his colleague, Vanessa, lived, the same Vanessa whose name appeared with suspicious frequency in his text messages. "This steak is excellent," Richard commented, oblivious to my thoughts. "You've outdone yourself." "Thank you," I replied, taking a measured sip of my wine. "I've been practicing." In truth, I'd barely tasted my food. My mind was too busy processing the other details Grandfather had shared during our brief phone conversation that afternoon. Richard hadn't just opened one account. There were 3, strategically structured to receive different types of assets. The main business account held the cash transfers. A brokerage account housed securities he'd moved from our joint investment portfolio. And a new IRA contained retirement funds he'd quietly rolled over from his previous employer's plan. Funds that should have been divided per our prenuptial agreement. Yes, the prenup. Richard had insisted on one, concerned that his future wealth needed protection. The document, drafted by his attorney, focused primarily on safeguarding his earning potential and career advancements. It had seemed reasonable at the time. Even my family's attorneys had found little to object to, knowing what they did about my separate assets. What the prenup explicitly prohibited, however, was the unilateral transfer of joint marital assets without written consent from both parties. A clause Richard had apparently forgotten, or perhaps gambled I would never discover his violations of. "I might need to go to Philadelphia next week," Richard announced as he finished his meal. Potential acquisition we're exploring. Probably. Need to stay 2 or 3 nights. I nodded sympathetically. "Philadelphia in September can be lovely. Will Vanessa be joining your team for the meetings?" His fork paused imperceptibly before continuing to his mouth. "The whole department will be there. Big presentation." Another lie to add to the growing collection. According to his executive assistant, a lovely woman who'd always found me more approachable than her boss, no Philadelphia trip existed on his calendar. "Well, I hope it goes well," I said, clearing our plates. I have my book club that week anyway. My book club was actually an emergency session with the Mercer Banking Group's legal team and private investigators, but Richard didn't need to know that yet. As I loaded the dishwasher, I contemplated how quickly my marriage had deteriorated into a strategic game of financial chess. When had Richard decided I was his opponent rather than his partner? What had triggered his elaborate scheme to hide our shared resources? More importantly, when had I decided to fight back? Perhaps it was the cumulative weight of 1,000 small dismissals. The way he'd begun referring to me as just a housewife at company functions. The condescending explanations of basic financial concepts I'd understood since childhood. The growing suspicion that the man I'd married viewed me as an accessory to his success rather than its partial architect. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps it was the fundamental betrayal of trust that hiding marital assets represented, a deliberate choice to prepare for our marriage's end without the integrity to address it directly. Either way, as I finished tidying our kitchen and listened to Richard make another work call behind his closed office door, I made a decision. This wasn't just about recovering money. This was about restoring balance, about challenging the narrative Richard had constructed, the financially naive wife, the corporate genius husband. It was time for a reckoning, but not yet. Not until I had every piece of evidence secured, every legal avenue explored, and every advantage leveraged. After all, as grandfather always said, in banking and in life, timing is everything. The next 2 weeks unfolded in a carefully choreographed dance of deception and discovery. Each morning, I'd maintain the facade of domestic normalcy, preparing Richard's favorite breakfast, inquiring about his workday, playing the role of the supportive yet financially dependent wife he clearly believed me to be. Each afternoon, once he was safely ensconced in his corner office at Westlake, I'd shift into a completely different persona. "Ms. Mercer, your grandfather is waiting in the conference room," announced Sophia, my family's longtime legal assistant, as I entered the discreet Park Avenue offices of Mercer Holdings. Unlike the grand, marble-clad headquarters of Mercer Banking Group, this subsidiary operated from an unmarked floor in a nondescript building, the perfect location for sensitive family matters. "Thank you, Sophia. Any word from the investigators, the SAI? Full report was delivered an hour ago. I've included it in your briefing materials." I smoothed my Armani suit, a power outfit I never wore at home, and entered the conference room where 5 people awaited me. Grandfather sat at the head of the table, as always, his posture impeccable despite his age. To his right sat Abigail Chen, the family's chief legal counsel, a woman whose Harvard credentials and courtroom reputation had earned her the nickname the Velvet Hammer. Devastating but elegant in execution. Beside her was David Mercer, my father's younger brother and the current CEO of Mercer Banking Group. On grandfather's left sat Martin Wells, our head of security and investigations, a former federal prosecutor whose network of contacts stretched from Wall Street to Washington. And finally, Rebecca Torres, the comptroller of First Regional Bank, who had been quietly monitoring Richard's accounts since my initial discovery. "Elena," grandfather greeted me with a nod. "We have a complete picture now." For the next hour, the team methodically dissected Richard's financial maneuvers, revealing a scheme more elaborate than I'd initially suspected. The presentation, delivered primarily by Martin, featured bank statements, property records, corporate filings, and surveillance photos that told a damning story. Richard hadn't just been hiding assets. He'd been preparing for a complete life transition. The shell company, Westlake Consulting LLC, was more than a temporary vehicle for our marital funds. It was the foundation of what appeared to be his exit strategy from both our marriage and his current employer. "Based on communications we've intercepted," Martin explained, displaying emails recovered through legal but sophisticated means, "your husband has been collaborating with Vanessa Chambers to establish a competing pharmaceutical consultancy. They've already approached 3 of Westlake's major clients with proposals." I absorbed this information with an outward calm that belied my inner turmoil. The financial betrayal had been painful enough. Discovering it was intertwined with professional and likely personal infidelity added layers of hurt I hadn't anticipated. The timeline appears to be accelerating, Rebecca added, sliding a folder toward me. In the past week alone, he's liquidated another $200,000 from your joint brokerage accounts and transferred them to the business account. Additionally, he's applied for a commercial lease in Stamford, Connecticut under the LLC's name. Stamford, where Vanessa had recently purchased a luxury condominium, according to the property records in Martin's report. There's more, Abigail said, her tone shifting slightly. 2 days ago, he consulted with Thomas Harrington. The name hung in the air like an unpleasant odor. Thomas Harrington was one of the city's most aggressive divorce attorneys, known for helping high-earning spouses shield assets and minimize settlements. I see, I said, maintaining my composure. And the asset total? Rebecca consulted her notes. Approximately $1.2 million across all identified accounts. This includes the cash transfers, liquidated securities, and retirement funds. There's also a safe deposit box at the First Regional branch in Stamford, accessed 3 times in the past month. I nodded, processing the information. Nearly half our marital assets, systematically extracted and repositioned for Richard's post-divorce life. A life that, based on the evidence before me, included a new business, a new location, and almost, certainly, a new partner. What are my options? I asked, looking directly at Abigail. The attorney straightened her already impeccable posture. From a legal standpoint, you're in an unusually advantageous position. The prenuptial agreement he insisted upon contains specific clauses prohibiting precisely these actions. His violation of those terms could result in the nullification of the protective provisions he included for himself. Meaning that instead of the equal division of assets specified in the agreement, the court could award you punitive damages and a significantly larger percentage of marital property. Additionally, his attempt to hide assets constitutes fraud, which could have criminal implications. Uncle David, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. There's also the banking angle. As you know, First Regional falls under our corporate umbrella. While we must maintain certain ethical standards regarding customer accounts, there are regulatory obligations regarding suspicious financial activity. My grandfather's eyes gleamed with a mixture of pride and righteous indignation. What David is too diplomatic to say is that we have both the legal right and the moral obligation to freeze accounts, showing patterns consistent with financial fraud, particularly when those accounts appear to be funneling marital assets in violation of a legally binding agreement. The implications were clear. With a single decision, I could not only halt Richard's scheme, but also potentially trigger an investigation that would devastate his professional reputation and future prospects. I need time to consider the best approach, I said finally. How long can we continue monitoring without taking action? Martin consulted his calendar. Based on the current acceleration rate, I'd estimate 2 weeks before he completes the major asset transfers. The commercial lease begins on the 1st of next month, which suggests a timeline for his broader plans. I nodded, thinking through the implications. And if I wanted to confront him with this information, what's the most strategic approach? For the next half hour, we outlined various scenarios, weighing the legal, financial, and personal considerations of each. By the time the meeting concluded, I had a clear strategy and timeline, one that would allow me to reclaim not just our marital assets, but also my dignity. As I gathered my materials, my grandfather gestured for the others to leave us. When the door closed behind them, he studied me with eyes that had witnessed nearly 9 decades of human triumph and folly. Elena, he said gently, I've watched you handle this situation with remarkable poise, but I need to ask, are you certain you want to proceed this way? There are simpler approaches available to us. I knew what he meant. With the Mercer resources at my disposal, I could simply hire attorneys to handle everything, removing myself from the confrontation entirely. It would be cleaner, less emotional, more aligned with how our family typically managed unpleasant situations. I need to face him myself, I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. This isn't just about the money. It's about correcting a fundamental misperception. Grandfather nodded slowly. The perception that you could be so easily deceived. Exactly. For years, I've allowed Richard to believe I was financially naive. Initially, to protect myself from being valued only for my family connections, but later, I paused, confronting an uncomfortable truth. Later, I maintained the charade because it seemed easier than challenging his need to feel superior. And now? Now I realize that by enabling his condescension, I became complicit in creating the man who believed he could steal from me without consequences. I straightened my shoulders. I won't make that mistake again. As I left the building and changed back into the casual clothes Richard expected his wife to wear, I reflected on the double life I'd been leading, not just the secret family wealth and connections I'd hidden from my husband, but the gradual diminishment of self I'd permitted in my marriage. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped correcting Richard when he interrupted me at dinner parties. I'd begun deferring to his opinions on topics I was more qualified to address. I'd allowed his narrative, the financially savvy husband, the decorative wife, to override the reality of our partnership. That evening, as Richard returned home, I greeted him with the same warm smile I'd perfected over years of growing disillusionment. I listened to his complaints about incompetent colleagues and nodded at his vague explanations about investment, reallocations that had required his attention that day. "How was your day?" he asked perfunctorily, barely glancing up from his phone. "Productive," I replied truthfully. "I feel like I'm finally getting clarity on some things that have been confusing me." He made a non-committal sound, clearly not registering the significance of my words. "That's nice, honey. Listen, I might need to cut our weekend plans short. Something's come up at work that needs my attention on Sunday." Another lie. According to Martin's surveillance, Richard had scheduled a meeting with Vanessa and their newly retained business attorney at her Stamford condominium. They were finalizing the operating agreement for their new venture, a venture funded with our marital assets. "No problem," I said, matching his casual tone. "I understand how important your work is." For a moment, genuine surprise flickered across his face. He'd clearly expected more resistance to his disruption of our long-planned anniversary weekend. Then, mistaking my acquiescence for ignorance rather than strategy, he rewarded me with an indulgent smile. "Thanks for understanding," he said, dropping a perfunctory kiss on my forehead. Not every wife would be so supportive of her husband's career demands. I returned his smile with practiced ease. "We all have our roles to play, don't we?" Indeed we did. And in exactly 12 days, Richard would discover just how dramatically those roles were about to change. "You seem different lately," Richard remarked over breakfast exactly 1 week before my planned confrontation. "More, I don't know, distracted?" I glanced up from my coffee, careful to maintain the perfect balance of mild concern and wifely devotion I'd perfected over the years. "Do I? I suppose I've had a lot on my mind." "Anything you want to talk about?" he asked, though his attention was already drifting back to his phone, where he'd been reviewing property listings in Stamford, information Martin had confirmed through digital surveillance. "Just thinking about the future," I replied truthfully. "How quickly things can change." This captured a fragment of his attention. "Change? What kind of change?" I shrugged, allowing a calculated vulnerability to show. "Life directions, priorities. You know I've been volunteering with that financial literacy program, and lately I've been wondering if I should be doing more with my skills." Richard's response was exactly what I'd anticipated, a mixture of patronizing encouragement and subtle dismissal. "That's sweet, honey," he said, reaching across to pat my hand condescendingly. "Those little workshops you help with are a nice community service, but don't put too much pressure on yourself. Not everyone needs to have a high-powered career." I nodded, as if genuinely comforted by his assessment. "You're probably right. Still, I've been considering taking some courses at the community college, maybe accounting or basic finance." Now I had his full attention, though not for the reasons he might have assumed. According to Martin's intelligence, Richard had been telling Vanessa that I was completely financially dependent on him, a narrative that supported his planned divorce strategy. "Accounting," he repeated, unable to fully mask his concern. "That seems unexpected. Is this because of those questions you had about our investments? Because I told you, Elena, I have everything under control." "Oh, I know you do," I assured him. "This is just for me, personal growth." He seemed to relax slightly, his inherent confidence in my financial ignorance reasserting itself. "Well, if that's what you want. Though honestly, with your aptitudes, maybe something like interior design would be more suitable." I bit back the response I longed to make, that I'd been analyzing complex financial instruments since before he knew what a hedge fund was, and instead offered a non-committal smile. "I'll consider that too." The conversation shifted to his upcoming business trip, which we both knew was actually a weekend with Vanessa finalizing their new office setup. As he detailed his fabricated itinerary, I marveled at how comfortable he'd become with lying to my face, and how blind he remained to the possibility that I might be capable of uncovering his deception. Later that day, as Richard headed to what he called a client lunch, actually a meeting with Thomas Harrington, according to Martin's surveillance team, I used my secure phone to check on our counterintelligence measures. "Rebecca, it's Elena," I said when the first regional comptroller answered. "Any unusual activity?" "He's accelerating the timeline," she replied without preamble. "This morning he initiated transfers for another $140,000 from your joint investment account. He's also applied for a business line of credit using the assets already in the Westlake Consulting accounts as collateral. And our monitoring remains undetected?" "Absolutely. We've implemented the protocols you approved. All transaction alerts to his devices show only the standard confirmations. The secondary notifications with the actual details are being diverted to our secure server." "Excellent. And the documentation?" "Everything is being recorded with proper chain of custody. Ms. Chen has reviewed the procedures personally and confirms they'll meet evidentiary standards if needed." I thanked her and ended the call, then opened my secure email to review the latest updates from Abigail. The legal preparations were proceeding exactly as planned. Petitions were drafted, affidavits prepared, and emergency motions ready to file, the moment I gave the word. What had begun as simple financial self-protection had evolved into something more comprehensive, a complete counter-strategy to address not just Richard's theft of our marital assets, but also his planned corporate espionage against his current employer. The investigation had uncovered that Richard and Vanessa weren't simply starting a competing consultancy. They were systematically downloading proprietary research and client information from Westlake's servers. This intellectual property theft would form the foundation of their new venture, giving them an unearned competitive advantage while potentially devastating Westlake's market position. While I had no particular loyalty to Westlake Pharmaceuticals, the revelation of Richard's corporate duplicity had crystallized something important. His deception wasn't limited to our marriage. It was a pattern, a character defect that permeated every aspect of his life. He wasn't just betraying me, he was betraying everyone who trusted him. This insight had led me to make a difficult decision. After consultation with my family's legal team, I had initiated confidential contact with Westlake's general counsel, providing anonymous but actionable intelligence about the security breach. The company had quietly implemented enhanced monitoring, of both Richard's and Vanessa's network activities, gathering their own evidence separate from our investigation. The trap was nearly set. Each day, Richard dug himself deeper into a hole of his own making, unaware that his every move was being documented by multiple entities with overlapping interests in his downfall. That evening, Richard returned home later than usual, bringing an expensive bottle of wine and an uncharacteristic attentiveness that immediately triggered my suspicions. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning," he announced as he decanted the Bordeaux with practiced precision, "about wanting to do more with your skills." "Oh?" I kept my tone neutral as I continued preparing dinner. "I think it's a wonderful idea. In fact," he paused for effect, swirling his wine with studied nonchalance, "I'd like to help you." Warning. Bells clanged in my mind. Richard never offered to help unless it served his interests somehow. "That's thoughtful," I replied cautiously. "What did you have in mind?" He leaned against the counter, his expression a masterful blend of supportive husband and financial mentor. "I think you should take those courses you mentioned. But why settle for community college? There are excellent certificate programs at the university that could really give you marketable skills." Ah, now I understood. He was laying groundwork, creating a narrative of an unemployed wife he'd supported through education. A narrative that would play well in divorce proceedings when he argued against substantial alimony. And, he continued, warming to his theme, "To show you I'm serious, I'd like to set aside some money specifically for your education. I could open an account in your name, seed it with, say, $25,000 to cover tuition and expenses." The audacity was breathtaking. He was offering to create a token account for me using a fraction of the marital assets he'd already stolen. "That's generous," I said, infusing my voice with exactly the right note of surprised gratitude. "But are you sure we can afford that right now? I know you've been concerned about market volatility affecting our investments." His smile didn't waver, but I caught the calculation behind his eyes. "For your future? Absolutely. Besides, I've been very strategic with our finances lately. We're more secure than you might think." "I bet we are," I thought, remembering the offshore account Martin had discovered just yesterday. A Cayman Islands repository Richard had established to eventually house the proceeds from his and Vanessa's new venture. "Well, if you're sure," I said, appearing to relent. "Though maybe we should start smaller? 5,000, perhaps?" Now I saw a flash of relief cross his features. My apparent financial timidity confirmed his assessment of me as no threat to his schemes. "Let's split the difference," he offered magnanimously. 15,000. Enough to get you started on a real educational path. I nodded, seemingly overcome by his generosity. "Thank you, that's really supportive." He raised his glass in a toast. "To your future." If only he knew how prophetic those words would prove to be, though not in the way he intended. The next morning, as promised, Richard set up a new account in my name at First Regional Bank, transferring $15,000 from one of his shell accounts. The transaction appeared on Rebecca's monitoring system within minutes, adding another piece of evidence to our growing collection. What Richard couldn't have known was that this seemingly minor transaction would become one of the final pieces in our legal strategy, proof that he was attempting to create the appearance of financial support while systematically draining the actual marital resources. He transferred the full amount, I confirmed to Abigail during our secure call later that day. From the Westlake Consulting operating account, not from our legitimate joint funds. "Perfect," the attorney replied, satisfaction evident in her voice. "That completes the circle. He's now demonstrably using misappropriated marital assets to create a false narrative of spousal support. Judge Crawford will have a field day with this." Judge Eleanor Crawford, the family court judge who would likely preside over our divorce proceedings if Richard filed as planned. A jurist known for her zero-tolerance policy toward financial shenanigans in divorce cases. Does this change our timeline? I asked, reviewing the calendar where I'd marked the date of our planned confrontation in red. I don't think so. Based on the intelligence from Mr. Wells, your husband intends to serve you with divorce papers next Monday, likely after. He returns from his business trip, where he'll actually be finalizing the new office setup with Ms. Chambers. And Westlake's internal investigation? Proceeding in parallel with ours. Their general counsel has confirmed they'll be ready to act on the same day if needed. I ended the call and stood by the window of my family's Park Avenue office, watching the city bustle below. In 5 days, Richard would return from his weekend with Vanessa, expecting to find his accommodating wife waiting at home, blissfully ignorant of his plans to dismantle our marriage and steal our joint assets. Instead, he would walk into a carefully orchestrated revelation of his own making. Every deception exposed, every scheme documented, every escape route blocked. The thought brought less satisfaction than I'd anticipated. There was no joy in confirming that the man I'd loved and trusted for a decade was capable of such calculated betrayal. But there was a certain grim resolution in knowing that I would no longer enable his duplicity, neither toward me nor anyone else. The breaking point came 3 days before Richard's planned business trip with Vanessa. I'd maintained my performance flawlessly, playing the role of supportive wife while meticulously documenting every aspect of his betrayal. But that Wednesday evening, as we shared a rare dinner together at home, something inside me shifted. "I've been thinking about your education fund," Richard said, refilling his wine glass with the expensive Cabernet I'd selected. "Maybe we should consider setting up a trust instead of a simple savings account. More tax advantages that way." The audacity was staggering. He was discussing tax optimization strategies for the pittance he'd generously allocated to me, while secretly transferring millions to accounts intended to fund his new life with another woman. "A trust?" I repeated, maintaining my carefully cultivated expression of mild interest. "Isn't that rather complicated for just $15,000? Richard waved his hand dismissively. "It's the principle, Elena. Smart financial planning. Works at any scale. Besides," he added with that patronizing smile I'd grown to despise, "it's good practice for you. A learning opportunity." A learning opportunity. As if I hadn't spent years studying financial structures that Richard couldn't begin to comprehend. As if my family hadn't built one of the most sophisticated banking networks on the Eastern Seaboard. "That's thoughtful," I replied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Though I have to admit, some of these financial concepts still confuse me." His smile widened, satisfaction evident in the relaxation of his shoulders. "That's perfectly natural, honey. Finance isn't everyone's strong suit." "Like prenuptial agreements," I said, the words escaping before I could reconsider. "Those can be quite complex, can't they?" Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his expression momentarily uncertain before the confidence reasserted itself. "They can be. Fortunately, ours was quite straightforward." "Was it?" I took a deliberate sip of my wine, watching him over the rim of my glass. I was just remembering the clause about unilateral asset transfers, Section 4.3, I believe, the one that specifically prohibited either party from moving joint assets without written consent. The color drained from his face so rapidly, I might have been concerned if I hadn't been so focused on maintaining my composure. For a moment, genuine fear flashed in his eyes before he marshaled his features back into a mask of casual confidence. "You've been reviewing our prenup?" he asked, aiming for lightness but landing somewhere closer to alarm. "Just trying to educate myself?" I replied with a small shrug. "As you suggested." Richard set down his fork carefully, his mind visibly racing behind the facade of calm. "Well, legal language can be misleading for non-professionals. Those clauses are typically focused on major assets, property, significant investments, not routine financial management." "I see." I nodded as if accepting his explanation. "So transferring, say, half our joint savings without discussion would..." Fall under routine management? The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's expression cycled through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, calculation, denial, and finally, a brittle attempt at control. "Elena," he began, his tone shifting to one I recognized from countless business calls, the voice he used when damage control was required. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Any transfers I've made have been for our mutual benefit, properly documented and completely transparent." I maintained eye contact, allowing the silence to stretch uncomfortably before responding. "Transparent," I repeated softly. "Like the Westlake Consulting LLC account at First Regional Bank? Or the Cayman Islands arrangement you finalized last week?" The blood drained from his face completely now, leaving his tanned skin an unhealthy grayish hue. His wineglass trembled slightly as he set it down with exaggerated care. "How do you—" he began, then caught himself. "I don't know what you're talking about." In that moment, watching him flounder between confession and continued deception, I made a decision that altered my carefully constructed timeline. The confrontation I'd planned for the following Monday, after his weekend with Vanessa, after the final incriminating transfers were complete, suddenly seemed unnecessarily delayed. "Richard," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing. "Through my system, I know everything. The systematic draining of our joint accounts, the shell company, the competing business you're establishing with Vanessa, the proprietary information you've stolen from Westlake, the consultation with Thomas Harrington about divorce strategy. All of it." He stared at me, momentarily speechless, before his survival instincts kicked in. "You've been spying on me?" he demanded, attempting to seize the moral high ground through indignation. "Invading my privacy? That's unacceptable, Elena, and potentially illegal." I couldn't help but laugh, a genuine, spontaneous reaction that clearly unsettled him further. "That's your response? To accuse me of wrongdoing for discovering? Your fraud?" "It's not fraud," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's financial planning, protection. You wouldn't understand the complexities." "Stop." I raised my hand, suddenly exhausted by the pretense. "Just stop, Richard. The condescension, the lies, all of it. It's over." He seemed to regain some composure, straightening in his chair and adopting the expression I'd seen him use in difficult negotiations. "Look, I understand you're upset. Finding this information without proper context must have been confusing. But I can explain everything if you'll just listen rationally." "Explain." I nodded, curious despite myself about what possible justification he might construct. "Please do." Richard took a deep breath, clearly organizing the narrative he'd prepared for this eventuality, though clearly he hadn't expected to deploy it quite so soon. "The business world is changing rapidly," he began, his tone sliding into the smooth cadence he used for board presentations. "Westlake is facing significant headwinds, regulatory challenges, market compression, leadership deficiencies. I've dedicated a decade to that company, but my future there is increasingly uncertain." He paused, gauging my reaction. When I remained silent, he continued with growing confidence. "So yes, I've been creating contingency plans, insurance essentially, against corporate turbulence that could leave us financially vulnerable. The separate accounts provide security that our primary financial institution can't offer. The business entity creates tax advantages and potential income diversification." I noticed he'd carefully avoided mentioning Vanessa or the divorce plans. "And the consultation with Thomas Harrington?" I prompted. "Was that also insurance?" A flicker of unease crossed his features before he regrouped. "Legal consultation about business structure. Thomas has expertise in both corporate and family law, which makes him valuable for complex planning." "I see," I said, nodding as if his explanation made perfect sense. "And I suppose the hotel reservations in Stamford this weekend under Vanessa's name, with your corporate card as backup, that's also business planning?" His composure fractured visibly now, confidence giving way to panic. "You've been tracking my credit cards, my private communications? Elena, that's necessary," I finished for him. "Given your systematic theft of our marital assets, it's not theft," he insisted, voice rising slightly. "They're my earnings, my career progression that's built our wealth." And there it was, the core belief that had enabled his betrayal, the conviction that our marital resources were fundamentally his, with my contribution negligible or non-existent. "Our wealth," I repeated softly. Interesting choice of words for someone who's been systematically separating yours from mine for months. Richard pushed back from the table, clearly needing physical distance to regain his equilibrium. "This conversation is unproductive. You're emotional, making accusations without understanding the financial complexities involved. We should discuss this another time, when you're calmer." I remained seated, oddly serene now that the confrontation had begun. "I agree that we should continue this discussion when all parties are properly prepared. Shall we say Monday morning, 10 a.m. at Abernathy and Wilson's offices?" His expression shifted from dismissive to wary. "The law firm? Why would we meet at a law firm?" "Because that's where my attorneys are preparing the financial fraud case against you," I replied simply. "And where Westlake's general counsel will be presenting their evidence regarding your corporate espionage and intellectual property theft." Richard's face went from pale to ashen. "You've spoken to Westlake? You had no right—" "Actually, I anonymously alerted their security team, which was my ethical obligation upon discovering the theft of proprietary information. Their investigation proceeded independently of mine." He began pacing now, agitation evident in every movement. "This is absurd. You're making threats based on misconstrued information. I have explanations for everything you think you found." "I'm sure you do," I agreed calmly, "and you'll have ample opportunity to present those explanations. To me, to Westlake's attorneys, and potentially to federal prosecutors depending on how the financial fraud investigation develops." Richard stopped pacing abruptly, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Who are you?" he asked, genuine bewilderment mixing with his anger. "This isn't— You're not acting like yourself." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd carefully curated the identity he expected: supportive, financially dependent, intellectually deferential. His confusion wasn't about me acting differently, it was about me finally dropping the performance. "That's an interesting question," I replied, rising from my seat. "Perhaps you should have asked it sometime during our 10-year marriage." I moved to the sideboard where I'd placed a thick folder earlier that day. Preparation for this confrontation that I hadn't expected to initiate quite so soon. Opening it, I extracted several documents and laid them on the table. "These are printouts of the most recent transfers from our joint accounts to Westlake Consulting LLC. This," I continued, placing another document beside the first, "is a copy of our prenuptial agreement, with the relevant sections highlighted. And this," I added a third document, "is a preliminary petition for divorce on grounds of financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty." Richard stared at the papers, his confident facade crumbling completely. "You've already filed for divorce?" "Not yet," I clarified. "This is the petition my attorneys have prepared. Its filing depends entirely on your next decisions." "My decisions?" he repeated, confusion evident. "Yes, Richard. For once in our marriage, I'm presenting you with completely transparent options." I laid out 3 business cards beside the documents. Option 1. We meet with my attorneys Monday morning to negotiate a fair division of assets, including the return of all misappropriated funds, followed by a quiet, dignified divorce. I pointed to the second card. Option 2. You refuse to cooperate, and we proceed with the fraud case, the Westlake intellectual property theft investigation, and public divorce proceedings that will detail every aspect of your misconduct. His eyes darted to the third card, Plain white with only a phone number embossed in silver. And option 3? That's my grandfather's private line, I said quietly. Franklin Mercer. Richard's confusion was evident. Your grandfather? What does he have to do with this? I took a deep breath, finally ready to reveal the truth I'd concealed for our entire relationship. Franklin Mercer, founder and chairman, emeritus of Mercer Banking Group, the parent company that owns First Regional Bank, where you've hidden our marital assets. Comprehension dawned slowly across his features, followed by disbelief, and then something approaching horror. Your family owns the bank? But you never said. You told me they were in finance, not that they. He stopped, the implications suddenly registering fully. You've been monitoring my accounts. You've had access to everything. Not personally, I clarified. There are regulations about such things. But once evidence of potential fraud was detected, the bank had both the right and the obligation to investigate. Richard collapsed into his chair, the full magnitude of his miscalculation finally sinking in. You knew, he whispered. You've always known. About finance, about banking. Everything I've explained to you over the years was often incorrect. I finished for him, but I chose not to correct you. Why? He demanded, genuine confusion mixing with his humiliation. Why pretend to be something you're not? The question struck me as so profoundly ironic coming from him that I almost laughed, but the truth deserved a serious answer. Initially, to be loved for myself rather than my family's wealth or connections, I replied honestly. Later, because I realized you needed to feel financially superior, and I made the mistake of prioritizing your ego over my authenticity. Richard stared at the 3 business cards, the weight of his decisions visibly pressing upon him. And if I call your grandfather? What's that option? Mercy, I said simply. Despite your actions, he's willing to speak with you directly, to find a solution that minimizes damage to all parties. He values discretion and efficiency over retribution. For a long moment, Richard said nothing, his worldview visibly reorganizing itself around these new revelations. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the patronizing confidence that had characterized our interactions for years. I need time to think, he said quietly. To process all this. I nodded, gathering my purse and the lightweight overnight bag. I'd packed earlier, a precaution in case the confrontation went poorly. You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow to decide which option you'll pursue. I'll be staying at the Four Seasons tonight to give you space for reflection. You're leaving? He asked, suddenly anxious. We should talk this through, figure out. We've had 10 years of talking, Richard. Most of it featuring you explaining things to me rather than genuinely listening. I moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it came to this. Not just your betrayal, but my complicity in the dynamic that enabled it. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, my phone buzzed with a text from Martin, confirming that surveillance would continue on the house and that Richard's movements would be monitored discreetly. Another message from grandfather assured me that my suite at the Four Seasons was prepared, with security protocols in place. For the first time in months, I felt the weight of deception lifting, not just Richard's betrayal, but my own carefully maintained facade. Whatever happened next, I would face it as my authentic self, not as the financially naive wife Richard had believed me to be. The turning point had arrived, not just in our marriage, but in my relationship with my own power and truth. The Four Seasons suite offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, lights twinkling like stars against the darkness. I stood at the window, phone in hand, awaiting Richard's decision while my team prepared for all possible scenarios. He's been making calls for the past 2 hours, Martin reported. First to Vanessa, then to his attorney, followed by 3 different financial advisors. He appears to be seeking alternative interpretations of his situation. Has he attempted to access any of the accounts? I asked, watching a helicopter drift between skyscrapers. He tried transferring funds from 2 of the shell accounts. Both transactions were quietly flagged by the system and held for review, as we arranged. He wouldn't see a denial, just an ordinary processing notification. I nodded, unsurprised. Richard's first instinct would be self-preservation, attempting to salvage what resources he could before accepting the inevitability of his situation. And Vanessa's reaction? Martin hesitated, a rare break in his professional demeanor. Based on the audio surveillance, she was unsympathetic. She suggested he was exaggerating the severity of the situation and insisted their plans proceed as scheduled. Of course she did. Vanessa had hitched her wagon to Richard's star, expecting an easy transition funded by our marital assets. The possibility that those resources might not materialize threatened her own careful planning. Ms. Mercer, Rebecca's voice came through on the conference line we'd established. We've completed the comprehensive audit of all accounts connected to your husband's activities. The final total is $1.4 million in diverted marital assets, plus approximately $220,000 in company resources redirected to the new venture. The figures were staggering, yet somehow less shocking than the calculated betrayal they represented. Money could be recovered. Trust could not. Thank you, Rebecca. Please prepare the complete documentation for Monday's meeting, regardless of which option Richard selects. I turned from the window, addressing the invisible team supporting me through the phone. Let's finalize our preparations for each scenario. For the next hour, we methodically reviewed our 3 contingency plans, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. Option 1, the cooperative settlement, would proceed through Abigail's careful mediation, with specific benchmarks for asset, recovery, and dissolution terms. Option 2, the adversarial legal approach, would involve simultaneous filings in family court and notifications to regulatory authorities. Option 3, my grandfather's intervention, remained the most fluid, dependent on Richard's willingness to accept responsibility and make amends. As we concluded the strategy session, I requested a moment alone with my grandfather, who had been quietly listening throughout. "How are you, Elena?" he asked once the others had disconnected. His voice, still commanding despite his age, carried the warmth he reserved for family. I paused, considering the question seriously. I'm surprisingly calm, almost detached, which concerns me slightly. The numbness is natural, he replied, his tone gentle. It's self-protection. The emotions will come later, when you feel safe enough to process them. And if they don't, then you're more like me than I thought, he chuckled softly. But they will. You're not made of stone, my dear, despite your remarkable performance these past weeks. I sank into the plush hotel chair, suddenly aware of the exhaustion I'd been holding at bay. I keep thinking about the wasted years, not just the marriage, but the person I allowed myself to become within it. Not wasted, grandfather corrected, firmly. You learned, you grew, you discovered your boundaries. These are never wasted experiences. I compromised myself, I countered. I dimmed my light to make him comfortable. And now you know never to do that again. His tone sharpened slightly, the banking titan momentarily displacing the doting grandfather. Elena, I've watched you handle this crisis with extraordinary precision and courage. Don't diminish that by dwelling on past choices you cannot change. Smiled despite myself. Franklin Mercer had never been one for prolonged introspection or regret. In his world, you assessed, decided, acted, and moved forward. Always forward. You're right, I conceded. Though I reserve the right to a substantial period of self-recrimination once this is resolved. 2 weeks, he countered in his negotiation. Voice. Then back to building your future. 1 month, and I'll reduce it to occasional moments of righteous indignation thereafter. Done. I could hear the smile in his voice. Now get some rest. Tomorrow will require all your faculties, regardless of Richard's choice. After we disconnected, I ordered room service, a luxury I rarely indulged in but seemed appropriate for this strange liminal evening between my old life and whatever came next. As I ate the exquisite meal alone in the elegant suite, I realized this was the first dinner in years where I hadn't monitored my comments, calibrated my reactions, or performed the role of the adoring wife. My phone chimed with a text just as I finished my creme brulee. Richard finally breaking his silence. "We need to talk. I'm downstairs." I stared at the message, momentarily uncertain. This wasn't part of our planned scenarios. Richard was supposed to deliberate overnight, contact one of the 3 numbers I'd provided, and proceed along the corresponding path. His presence at the hotel suggested he was attempting to create his own option, likely one that involved appealing to my emotions directly. "Richard is in the hotel lobby," I texted Martin, requesting access to my suite. Martin's response was immediate. "Security has visual confirmation. How would you like to proceed?" I considered my options carefully. Meeting Richard on neutral ground rather than at our home where memories and emotion might cloud my judgment could be advantageous. However, allowing him to dictate the terms of our interaction ran counter to the control I'd finally established. Have security escort him to the Peninsula room, I decided, naming one of the hotel's small conference spaces. Ensure the recording equipment is operational. I'll be down in 15 minutes. Confirmed. We'll have the room prepared and a security detail stationed discreetly. I changed from my comfortable hotel attire into a simple but elegant black dress. Armor, of a different sort than my usual business suits, but effective nonetheless. As I applied a touch of lipstick, I studied my reflection, searching for the woman Richard had married, the one who had gradually sublimated her identity to complement. She was gone, I realized. In her place stood someone both familiar and new, a synthesis of the financial prodigy I'd been before our marriage, and the woman who had learned painful but valuable lessons about trust, power, and authenticity. The Peninsula room was intimate, but formal, with a small conference table and comfortable chairs arranged for discreet conversations. Richard stood when I entered, his normally impeccable appearance noticeably disheveled. The confident executive had been replaced by a man visibly grappling with the collapse of his carefully constructed world. "Elena," he began, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for seeing me." I took the seat opposite him, maintaining both physical and emotional distance. "You said we needed to talk." He nodded, running his hand through his hair, a gesture of genuine distress I'd rarely seen from him. "I've been thinking about everything, about what you said, about our options." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "I want to explain." "I believe you already tried that," I responded evenly. "Your explanations were incomplete and largely fictional." "I know," he admitted, surprising me with his candor. "I was trying to salvage something unsalvageable." He placed his hands flat, on the table, as if steadying himself. "The truth is, I've been unhappy for a long time. Not with you specifically, but with my life, my choices. The pressure at Westlake, the constant performance required to maintain my position. It became overwhelming." I listened silently, neither accepting nor rejecting his narrative. When Vanessa approached me about starting our own firm, it seemed like an escape hatch, a way to break free from the corporate structure while maintaining the lifestyle I'd grown accustomed to. He met my eyes directly. "I convinced myself that you'd be fine, that the portion of our assets I left behind would be sufficient, and that your family would support you if needed." "My family," I repeated. "The one in finance that you never bothered to inquire about." He winced. "That's the part I'm still struggling to process. All these years you let me believe—" He stopped himself. "But that's not the point now. The point is that I made a series of catastrophic decisions based on pride, fear, and a fundamental misunderstanding of who you And what do you want now, Richard? I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the complex emotions his apparent sincerity was stirring. I want option 3, he said simply. The call with your grandfather. Of all the responses I'd anticipated, this was perhaps the least expected. Richard had always been fiercely independent, resistant to any suggestion that he needed assistance or guidance, particularly from authority figures. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. Because he understands this world in ways I clearly don't, Richard replied after a moment's consideration. And because, from what little I've researched since our conversation, he's known for being tough but fair. I don't deserve leniency, Elena, but I need a path forward that doesn't end with me in prison or professionally destroyed forever. I studied him carefully, searching for the manipulation that had characterized so many of our interactions over the years. What I saw instead was something unfamiliar, genuine humility. You understand that my grandfather won't simply make this disappear, I said. There will be consequences, repayment, probably a complete restructuring of your professional life. I understand. He nodded. I'm prepared for that. What I'm not prepared for is allowing my mistakes to hurt more people than they already have. Westlake employs hundreds of people who depend on the company's stability. A public scandal involving corporate espionage would devastate them, not just me. It was the first time in our conversation that Richard had acknowledged the broader implications of his actions beyond his personal circumstances. Whether this represented genuine growth or simply strategic thinking was impossible to determine, but it aligned with the values my grandfather would consider important. I'll arrange the call, I said finally. Tomorrow morning, as planned. But, Richard, I added, my tone hardening slightly, understand this clearly. If this is another manipulation, another attempt to find an easier way out of the consequences you've earned, it will fail spectacularly. My grandfather didn't build a banking empire by being easily deceived. I understand, he repeated, his expression sober. And Elena, regardless of what happens next, I'm sorry. Not just for the financial deception, but for how I've treated you over the years. You deserved better. I stood, signaling the end of our conversation. Yes, I agreed simply. I did. As I returned to my suite, I called my grandfather directly, bypassing our established communication protocols. He wants option 3, I reported without preamble. He came to the hotel to request it personally. Interesting, grandfather mused. What's your assessment? He seems genuinely shaken. Whether that's from the consequences he's facing or true remorse is harder to determine. And what outcome would you prefer, Elena? He asked, his question cutting to the heart of the matter. Considered this carefully. The anger and hurt I'd suppressed for weeks simmered beneath my carefully maintained composure, tempting me toward the harshest possible resolution. Yet something in Richard's unexpected humility had given me pause. Justice, I answered finally, but not vengeance. He should make amends, repay what he's taken, face professional consequences for his actions. But I don't need to destroy him to move forward with my life. A measured response, grandfather approved, and remarkably mature given the circumstances. I had an excellent teacher in restraint, I replied, the ghost of a smile forming despite the gravity of the situation. Very well. I'll see him at 9 tomorrow. And Elena? Whatever happens next, I'm proud of how you've handled this. You've shown yourself to be a true Mercer, strategic when necessary, compassionate when possible. As I prepared for bed in the Absich, luxurious but lonely hotel suite, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed in just a few short weeks. The marriage I'd invested a decade in was effectively over. The careful performance I'd maintained for years had been abandoned. The future I'd envisioned, increasingly empty as it had seemed, was now a blank canvas awaiting new definition. There was grief in these realizations, certainly. But beneath the sadness lay something unexpected, a profound sense of liberation. For the first time in years, I was fully myself. Not Richard's wife, not the deliberately diminished version of Elena I'd become, but the woman who had once fearlessly managed millions and held her own in boardrooms filled with seasoned executives. Whatever path Richard chose tomorrow, my own direction was finally clear. I would reclaim not just our marital assets, but my authentic self. The self I'd willingly compromised for the illusion of partnership. The road ahead might be uncertain, but I would walk it on my own terms, with my eyes wide open and my full capabilities engaged. That, I realized as sleep finally claimed me, was a victory worth far more than any financial settlement. At precisely 8:45 the next morning, I entered the private conference room at Mercer Banking Group's headquarters, a space I hadn't visited in years despite my family connection. The 35th floor sanctum featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district, its mahogany table and leather chairs exuding the quiet power that had characterized my grandfather's approach to business for nearly 6 decades. Abigail and Martin were already present, reviewing documents with the focused precision of experienced professionals preparing for a high-stakes negotiation. "Good morning, Elena," Abigail greeted me, her immaculate appearance betraying no sign of the early hour or the unusual circumstances. "How are you feeling?" "Ready," I replied, setting my portfolio on the table. "Any updates from surveillance?" Martin nodded, sliding a tablet toward me. "Mr. Morrison left the house at 7:30 this morning. He visited an ATM, withdrew the maximum daily limit, then proceeded to Vanessa Chambers' apartment. He remained there for approximately 20 minutes, before heading in this direction. Based on their conversation, which we recorded legally through his vehicle's compromised Bluetooth system, Ms. Chambers was unsupportive of his decision to meet with your grandfather." I skimmed the transcript displayed on the tablet, noting Vanessa's increasingly frantic objections as Richard explained his intention to pursue option 3. Her concern seemed less for his welfare than for the implications to their planned venture, and by extension, her own financial future. "She threatened to proceed without him," I observed, reaching the end of the conversation. "Yes," Martin confirmed. "Though without his client connections and the financial resources he promised, her position is significantly weakened." "And the accounts?" I turned to Rebecca, who had joined us via secure video link from First Regional's Operations Center. "All monitored accounts remain frozen through standard fraud protection protocols," she reported. "Mr. Morrison made 3 attempts to access various accounts this morning, presumably to secure additional funds before this meeting. All were quietly diverted with standard system unavailable messages." I nodded, absorbing this information, with a curious detachment. Just 24 hours ago, each new revelation of Richard's deception had felt like a personal wound. Now, his desperate maneuvers seemed almost predictable, the futile thrashing of a man finally facing the consequences of his actions. "And Westlake's investigation?" I asked, turning back to Martin. "Their security team completed their audit overnight. The evidence of intellectual property theft is conclusive. They've prepared termination paperwork for both Mr. Morrison and Ms. Chambers, along with potential criminal complaints." He paused, his expression professionally neutral despite the gravity of the information. "They're awaiting guidance from your grandfather regarding timing and approach." I wasn't surprised by Westlake's deference to my grandfather. Franklin Mercer's influence extended far beyond his official roles, a network of relationships and obligations carefully cultivated over decades. Though he held no formal position at Westlake, his investment firm had provided crucial financing during their expansion 5 years earlier, a connection that ensured his recommendations would receive serious consideration. "Mr. Mercer has arrived," announced Sophia through the intercom. "He'll join you shortly." The room fell silent as we awaited his appearance. Despite his advanced age, my grandfather maintained a formidable presence. his mind as sharp and his judgment as incisive as when he'd built his banking empire from a single branch in the 1960s. Even now, semi-retired and ostensibly focused on philanthropy, his opinion carried more weight in certain financial circles than regulatory guidelines or court rulings. The door opened, and Franklin Mercer entered with the quiet assurance of a man accustomed to commanding rooms far more intimidating than this one. At 84, he remained remarkably vital, tall and straight-backed, his silver hair impeccably styled, his bespoke suit a subtle declaration of taste and means. "Elena," he greeted me warmly, crossing to kiss my cheek before acknowledging, the others with respectful nods. "Is our guest arriving promptly?" "Security reports he's in the lobby now," Martin confirmed, checking his phone. "He's being escorted up as we speak." Grandfather took his seat at the head of the table, arranging his reading glasses and legal pad with methodical precision. "And you're certain about your preferred outcome?" he asked, his keen eyes finding mine. "Yes," I confirmed. "Justice without destruction." He nodded once, satisfying himself that my position remained consistent with our late-night conversation. "Very well, let us proceed with clarity and purpose." A soft knock preceded Sophia's announcement. "Mr. Morrison has arrived." "Show him in," Grandfather directed, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly, the banker preparing to assess a prospective client's creditworthiness. Richard entered with visible trepidation, his confident executive persona diminished by circumstances and the evident gravity of the meeting. Though impeccably dressed in one of his finest suits, he appeared somehow smaller, the psychological armor of arrogance and entitlement stripped away by the revelations of the previous evening. "Mr. Mercer," he began, extending his hand with a deference I'd never witnessed from him before. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." My grandfather stood, accepting the handshake with formal cordiality before gesturing to an empty chair, opposite mine. "Please sit down, Mr. Morrison. We have much to discuss and limited time to do so effectively." Richard took his seat, his gaze briefly meeting mine before darting away, unable to maintain contact. I maintained my neutral expression, determined that my emotions, the complex mixture of hurt, anger, and lingering affection, would not influence the proceedings. "Before we begin," Grandfather said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had intimidated financial titans and political leaders alike, "I want to establish the parameters of our discussion. This is not a negotiation in the traditional sense. You have committed multiple acts that could be prosecuted as criminal offenses: financial fraud, misappropriation of marital assets, corporate espionage, and potential securities violations. The evidence supporting these charges is comprehensive and incontrovertible." Richard paled but nodded, accepting the assessment without protest. "However," Grandfather continued, "my granddaughter has expressed a preference for resolution rather than retribution. This creates an opportunity for you to make amends in a manner that addresses the harm you've caused without necessarily destroying your future entirely." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. "What I need to determine is whether you truly understand the gravity of your actions and are prepared to accept meaningful consequences." Richard swallowed visibly, his hands clasped tightly on the table before him. "I understand," he said, his voice steadier than his appearance might suggest. "And I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary to make this right, or as right as it can be at this point." "Good," Grandfather nodded. "Then let's begin with a complete accounting of all misappropriated assets, both marital and corporate. Ms. Chen will provide the legal framework, and Ms. Torres will address the banking implications." For the next 2 hours, Richard cooperated, with increasing candor as the team methodically deconstructed his financial machinations. With each disclosure, each admission of intentional deception, I watched the remaining vestiges of his defensive posture dissolve. By the time we reached the discussion of the Cayman Islands account, the one he hadn't mentioned the previous evening, He was volunteering information without prompting, as if unburdening himself of secrets long carried. "That's everything," he said finally, reaching the end of Abigail's exhaustive checklist. "At least everything I can recall. If there's anything I've overlooked, it wasn't intentional." Grandfather studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Very well. Now we address consequences and remediation." He turned to Abigail. "The proposed settlement terms, please." Abigail opened a leather portfolio, extracting a document of several pages. "We've prepared a comprehensive agreement that addresses both the marital dissolution and the resolution of potential criminal charges. The key provisions are as follows." She proceeded to outline terms that were simultaneously fair and unsparing. Richard would relinquish all claim to our marital assets, including those he'd attempted to hide. He would formally acknowledge his breaches of fiduciary duty and accept a 5-year prohibition from serving as an officer or director of any public company. He would cooperate fully with Westlake's investigation, providing all information regarding the proprietary data he'd accessed and any external parties who might have received it. Most significantly, he would sign a confession of judgment for the full amount of misappropriated funds, secured by a lien against all his future earnings until repaid in full. In exchange, Abigail concluded, neither Ms. Mercer nor Westlake Pharmaceuticals will pursue criminal charges, provided all terms are met without deviation. The divorce will proceed on grounds of irreconcilable differences rather than fraud, with appropriate confidentiality provisions to protect both parties' privacy. And Mr. Mercer, she glanced at my grandfather, has agreed to facilitate a measured professional transition that allows you to maintain limited employment in your field, albeit with significant restrictions and oversight. Richard listened without interruption, his expression cycling through shock, relief, and finally, a somber acceptance. When Abigail finished, he remained silent for several moments, absorbing the full weight of the agreement. "This is fair," he said finally, his voice quiet but clear. "More than fair considering what I've done." "It is equitable," Grandfather corrected, making a subtle but important distinction. "Justice requires accountability, not annihilation. You will face meaningful consequences for your choices, Mr. Morrison, but you will retain the opportunity to rebuild your life on a more honest foundation." Richard nodded, genuine gratitude visible beneath his humbled expression. "Thank you. I don't deserve this consideration, but I appreciate it more than I can express." "Your gratitude should be directed to Elena," Grandfather said firmly. "She advocated for moderation when more severe measures would have been entirely justified." Richard turned to me, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since entering the room. "Elena, he began, then faltered, apparently recognizing the inadequacy of any words he might offer. "Save it," I said, not unkindly. "Just sign the agreements and honor their terms. That will mean more than any apology." He nodded, accepting this boundary without protest. "I will, I promise." The next hour was consumed with procedural matters. Signatures on multiple documents, notarizations, detailed instructions for asset repatriation, and the establishment of monitoring protocols to ensure compliance. Throughout this process, Richard maintained a subdued cooperation, answering questions directly and accepting each obligation without negotiation. As the meeting drew to a close, Grandfather addressed one final matter. "Regarding your employment situation, Mr. Morrison, Westlake will terminate you effective immediately, with a statement citing professional differences rather than misconduct, provided you sign their confidentiality and non-disparagement agreements. Through my associates, I've arranged a position with Hargrove Consulting in their Chicago office, middle management, significantly below your current title and compensation, but a starting point for rebuilding your career under appropriate supervision." Richard's surprise was evident. "Chicago? That's unexpected." Geographical separation from your recent activities seems prudent, grandfather replied evenly. Both professionally and personally. The implication was clear. Richard would be removed from his current environment, distanced from Vanessa and others who had participated in or enabled his misconduct. It was neither punishment nor favor, but rather a practical measure to facilitate genuine rehabilitation. I understand, Richard said after a moment's consideration, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. As the meeting concluded and security arrived to escort Richard to his next appointment, a similar but likely less generous reckoning with Westlake's legal team, he paused at the door, turning back to face me one last time. Elena, he said, simply, I'm sorry, not just for what I did, but for who I was. You deserved better. I maintained my composed expression, offering a single nod of acknowledgement without verbal response. Some recognitions came too late to merit more. When the door closed behind him, I felt a curious lightness, not the vindictive satisfaction I might have anticipated, but rather the release of a burden I hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. The marriage was over, the deception exposed, the consequences assigned. What remained was the opportunity to reclaim my life on my own terms. You handled that with remarkable grace, grandfather observed as the others gathered their materials and prepared to depart. Many would have demanded more severe punishment. Punishment wasn't the point, I replied, surprising myself with the clarity of my conviction. The point was correction. Of the immediate situation, yes, but more importantly, of the imbalanced dynamic that allowed it to develop in the first place. He studied me with evident pride. You've grown through this experience in ways that extend far beyond the specific circumstances. I suppose adversity accomplishes what comfort cannot, I said, gathering my portfolio and standing to embrace him. Thank you for your guidance through all of this. You hardly needed it, he replied, his eyes twinkling with genuine affection. You orchestrated the entire resolution yourself. I merely provided the venue and a bit of gravitas. As we walked together toward the elevator, I felt the culmination of tension that had been building since I discovered that first suspicious transfer. The confrontation I'd been preparing for, the moment of maximum pressure before resolution, had arrived and passed. Richard had made his final, desperate moves, the ATM withdrawal, the visit to Vanessa, the attempts to access frozen accounts, and found himself checkmated by the very systems he thought he understood. What remained now was the aftermath, the practical matters of financial restoration, legal finalization, and personal healing. The dramatic climax had given way to denouement, the resolution of plot threads, and the establishment of a new equilibrium. Yet even as one chapter closed, I sensed another beginning. One in which I would no longer shape myself to accommodate another's ego or diminish my capabilities to preserve a false harmony. The woman who had hidden her financial acumen and banking, connections to be loved for herself, was gone, replaced by someone who recognized that authenticity, not performance, was the only foundation worth building upon. 6 months after that pivotal meeting, I stood in my new office at Mercer Financial Group watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of gold. The transition had been remarkably smooth. Divorce finalized, assets restored, professional identity reclaimed. Richard had honored our agreement, moving to Chicago and dutifully making his monthly restitution payments. Our communication was limited to practical matters, gradually diminishing as our separate lives took shape. Vanessa's venture had collapsed without Richard's connections or my family's unwitting financial support. Westlake had recovered quickly once the leadership breach was addressed. As for me, I'd finally stepped fully into my heritage and capabilities, accepting a directorship at the family firm while launching a foundation focused on financial literacy for women leaving controlling relationships. Ms. Mercer, my assistant called through the intercom, your grandfather is here for your dinner appointment. I smiled, gathering my coat and bag. Franklin had become not just my mentor, but my closest confidant through the reconstruction of my life. The quarterly reports exceeded projections, he announced as we walked toward the elevator. Your division outperformed all others. Banking is in my blood, I replied simply. I just needed to stop hiding it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.